She was 23 and homeless. No family left, no savings, just a canvas rucksack and $10 she had earned scrubbing pots at a diner in Staunton. And with that $10, she bought an abandoned Stagecoach Inn on the old Valley Turnpike in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, in a stretch of Augusta County that had not seen a traveler cross the inn's threshold since 1912. The limestone walls were standing. The chimney stack was whole. But what nobody knew was that hidden in the root cellar beneath that old inn was something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Prue Whitaker had grown up with the smell of food cooked over an open fire. Not the backyard barbecue smell of charcoal and lighter fluid, the deeper, older, more layered smell of hardwood coals banked in a stone hearth, and iron pots hanging from a crane, and bread baking in a Dutch oven set in the ashes, and meat turning slowly on a spit above the embers. Her grandmother had taught her to cook by that smell, to know when the bread was done, and when the beans were ready, and when the meat needed turning, all without lifting a lid or opening a door, just by standing near the hearth and breathing. Her grandmother's name was Dileia Whitaker, and she had run a roadside boarding house on Route 11 outside the town of Greenville, Virginia, for 28 years. Dileia had not run a bed and breakfast or a country inn or any of the polished things those words suggested. Dileia had run a boarding house, a plain clapboard building with 6 rooms upstairs and a kitchen downstairs that served 3 meals a day to whoever walked in. And the people who walked in had been truck drivers and construction workers and traveling salesmen and migrant farm laborers and the occasional family passing through the valley on their way somewhere else. The meals had been plain: beans and cornbread, pot roast and potatoes, biscuits and gravy, fried chicken and greens, and they had been cooked on a massive stone hearth that Dileia's husband, a man named Boyd, had built in 1966 from limestone he had quarried himself from the hillside behind the house. Dileia had been born in 1941 in a hollow outside Greenville, the daughter of a subsistence farmer named Cletus Whitaker, who had raised hogs and tobacco on 30 acres of rocky hillside, and who had fed his family from a kitchen garden and a smokehouse and a root cellar dug into the bank behind the cabin. Cletus had cooked on an open hearth his entire life. Not because he was nostalgic for the old ways, but because the cabin did not have electricity until 1958. And because a man who has cooked on a hearth for 40 years does not switch to an electric range when the power finally arrives, because the hearth gives him heat and light and a place to sit in the evening, and the electric range gives him none of those things. Dileia had learned to cook on Cletus's hearth. She had learned the specific skills of hearth cooking, how to bank coals to create different temperature zones, how to hang a pot at the right height on the crane so the liquid simmered rather than boiled, how to rotate a Dutch oven in the ashes so the bread baked evenly on all sides, how to read the color of the coals to know their temperature. Red-orange coals were about 400 degrees, good for baking. White-gray coals were about 600 degrees, good for searing. Dark red coals were about 250 degrees, good for slow cooking beans or stewing meat through the afternoon. Dileia had learned these temperatures by sight, and the learning had been done by standing beside the fire and paying attention. Dileia had opened the boarding house in 1974, the year Prue's mother was born, and she had run it until 2002 when her knees had made the standing impossible. 28 years of cooking 3 meals a day for an average of 8 to 12 people. Every meal cooked on the stone hearth, every pot hung from the crane, every biscuit baked in the ashes. Dileia had never used the electric stove Boyd had installed in 1975. She had used it as a shelf. The hearth was her kitchen, and the kitchen was the reason people came, because the food tasted different when it was cooked over hardwood coals, deeper, smokier, with a complexity that an electric range could not produce. And the truck drivers and construction workers who stopped at Dileia's boarding house on Route 11 had known this, and they had come back week after week, year after year, because the beans and cornbread at Dileia's tasted like the beans and cornbread their grandmothers had made, and that taste was worth the stop. Delia had told Prue stories from the boarding house the way certain grandmothers tell trade stories, as case studies, as instruction, as a way of teaching a child that the work was not just physical, but relational. She told Prue about the truck driver named Harold, who had stopped at the boarding house every Tuesday night for 9 years, from 1981 until 1990, and who had always ordered the same thing, beans, cornbread, and black coffee, and who had never said more than, "Thank you, ma'am," in 9 years until the last Tuesday when he had set his fork down and said, "Mrs. Whitaker, I've been eating at every diner and truck stop between Roanoke and Winchester for 20 years, and this is the only place where the food tastes like it was cooked by somebody who knows my name." Delia had said, "I do know your name, Harold." Harold had looked at her and said, "That's what I mean." She told Prue about the winter of 1994, when an ice storm had knocked out power across Augusta County for 8 days, and Delia's boarding house had been the only place in Greenville with a working kitchen, because the hearth did not need electricity. Delia had cooked for 37 people that week, her regular boarders plus every neighbor within walking distance who had no heat and no stove, feeding them beans and cornbread and stewed chicken and hot coffee from the crane, and nobody had paid because Delia had not charged, because a hearth that feeds only paying customers when the neighbors are cold is not a hearth worth having. Delia had also known about the old Stagecoach Inn. 5 miles south of the boarding house, on the original Valley Turnpike, the old road that had connected Staunton to Lexington before Route 11 was built, stood a limestone building that had been the Whitaker Inn from 1843 until 1912, when the automobile had made the stagecoach obsolete and the inn had closed. The inn had been built by a man named Josiah Whitaker, Delia's great-great-grandfather, who had operated it as a stopping point for stagecoach travelers heading south through the Shenandoah Valley. The inn had fed and housed travelers for 69 years, 3 generations of Whitakers standing at a hearth that was, according to Delia, the largest stone hearth in Augusta County, 6 feet wide and 4 feet tall, with a rotating crane that could hold 6 pots at once, and a spit jack that could turn 2 roasts simultaneously. Josiah Whitaker fed every person who came through that door, Delia told Prue once, on a winter evening when Prue was 9, and Delia was teaching her to bank coals. He didn't ask who they were or where they were going or whether they could pay. He fed them first and asked questions later. That was the rule of the road. A traveler who is hungry is a traveler who cannot think clearly, and a traveler who cannot think clearly will make a bad decision on the road. Josiah understood that feeding a stranger was not charity. It was safety. Feed the traveler. Then ask. Delia had married Boyd Whitaker in 1963. Boyd had been a stonemason who had worked on the restoration of historic buildings across the Shenandoah Valley for 30 years, and who had built the boarding house hearth with the specific care of a man who understood that a hearth was not a fireplace. A fireplace was decorative. A hearth was functional. A hearth had to hold a cooking fire for 6 hours a day, 365 days a year, without cracking, and the limestone Boyd had quarried from the hillside had been chosen because limestone held heat evenly and released it slowly and did not crack under thermal stress. Boyd had died in 2003. Delia had continued alone for 1 more year before selling the boarding house. Delia and Boyd had had 1 daughter, a woman named June, who was Prue's mother. June had worked as a waitress at a diner in Staunton and had raised Prue alone after Prue's father, a man named Lyle, a long-haul trucker, had left when Prue was 3. June had done her best, which had been a 2-bedroom apartment on a waitress's salary and a weariness that had settled into June's face by the time she was 35, and that had not lifted. June had died of a heart attack at 41 when Prue was 18. Prue had been alone since. Prue had spent every weekend and every school break at Delia's boarding house from the time she was 5. The boarding house had been the fixed point, the place where the air smelled like wood smoke and cornbread, and the hearth was always burning, and there was always a pot of beans on the crane and a plate for whoever walked in. Delia had put Prue to work immediately, not as play, but as real kitchen work that mattered. Prue had started with fire tending at 5. She had carried kindling from the wood box to the hearth and fed the fire when the coals got low, learning to read the color of the coals the way Dileia read them, by looking, not by thermometer. By 7, Dileia had taught her to cook on the hearth. The first thing she had cooked was cornbread, stirring the batter in a cast-iron bowl, pouring it into a greased Dutch oven, setting the Dutch oven in the ashes, and raking hot coals onto the lid so the bread baked from above and below simultaneously. "Don't peek," Dileia said. "The bread tells you when it's done. Listen for the sound. When it stops sizzling, it's set. When it starts to smell like toast, it's done. If it smells like burning, you waited too long." Prue had not waited too long. The cornbread had come out golden on top and brown on the bottom, and the crumb had been dense and moist, and the truck driver, who had eaten the first slice, had said, "Who made this?" Dileia said, "My granddaughter." The truck driver said, "She's 7?" Dileia said, "She's been standing at this hearth since she was 5. The hearth doesn't know how old she is." By 10, Prue could cook a full dinner on the hearth: beans, cornbread, pot roast, and greens, managing 4 pots on the crane simultaneously, rotating each one to control the heat, timing the bread so it came out when the meat was ready. By 13, she could cook for 12 people without help, and the regulars had begun to notice. A construction foreman named Hector, who ate at the boarding house 3 nights a week, told Dileia, "The beans taste different when the girl cooks." Dileia said, "They're the same beans." Hector said, "They taste different. They taste more patient." Dileia had liked that answer. She told Prue later, "Hector is right. Your beans are more patient than mine. I rush the simmer." You don't. That's the difference between a cook who has been doing it for 28 years and a cook who has been doing it for 8. The 8-year cook still pays attention. The 28-year cook thinks she already knows. By 15, Prue was doing the breakfast shift alone 3 mornings a week, while Dileia sat in a chair beside the hearth and watched and said nothing because there was nothing to say. Prue had the hands and the timing and the nose, and a cook who has the hands and the timing and the nose does not need supervision. She needs a hearth. Dileia had also taught Prue about the old inn. On summer evenings, after the supper dishes were cleared and the boarders had gone upstairs, Dileia and Prue had sat on the boarding house porch in the cooling dark, and Dileia had told stories about Josiah Whitaker and the Stagecoach Inn, stories that had been passed down through 4 generations of Whitakers, each generation adding its own details and losing others, the way a recipe changes across decades of being cooked from memory rather than from a page. Dileia had told Prue that Josiah's hearth could cook for 40 people at once. She told her that the crane had been forged by a blacksmith in Staunton, who had made it from a single piece of iron heated and bent 7 times. She told her that the spit jack, the clockwork mechanism that turned the roasting spit, had been imported from England and had been the only spit jack in the Shenandoah Valley, and that Josiah had been so proud of it that he had listed it in his will as a separate item from the building. The man left the spit jack to his son and the inn to his wife, Dileia said. That tells you what he valued most. Dileia had died when Prue was 20, a quiet death at home in the old boarding house, which she had continued to live in after selling the business, on a Sunday morning in March. She had been sitting in her chair beside the hearth, which was cold. Dileia had not lit it since selling the business, and she had been holding a cast-iron ladle in her lap, the one she had used for 28 years to serve beans from the pot on the crane. The ladle was warm from her hands. She had been 81. She had cooked over 30,000 meals on that hearth across 28 years, and the hearth had been the last thing she looked at before she closed her eyes, and the ladle had been the last thing she held, and these were the correct last things for a woman who had fed strangers for a living. Prue had taken the ladle, a set of Dileia's hearth tongs, and a framed photograph of Dileia standing at the boarding house hearth in 1988, her face lit by the glow of the coals. She had also taken Dileia's cast-iron Dutch oven, the 12-inch lodge that Dileia had baked cornbread in every day for 28 years, seasoned black by 10,000 fires. After Dileia's death, Prue had continued working at the diner in Staunton where June had waitressed. scrubbing pots and washing dishes in the back kitchen $11 an hour. She had not cooked at the diner. The diner cooked on a flat-top grill and a deep fryer, and Prue had understood within her first week that a flat-top grill was to a hearth what a flashlight was to a fire. It produced the same product, but not the same experience, and the difference was everything. She scrubbed the pots and kept her mouth shut and saved what she could and drove Delia's old truck, the same 1988 Chevy that Boyd had bought and Dileia had driven for 14 years, to Greenville on weekends and walked the 2 miles down the old Valley Turnpike to the inn and stood on the porch and looked at the building through the windows and thought about the hearth inside. She had rented a room in a boarding house on Frederick Street for $350 a month. Not a boarding house like Delia's, not a place with a hearth and a pot of beans, but a plain cinder-block building with 12 rooms and a shared bathroom and a landlord who collected the rent on the first and did not ask questions. The boarding house had been condemned in March of Prue's 23rd year. The county building inspector had found structural cracks in the foundation and had posted the building. Prue had been given 14 days. If you're enjoying this story, take a second and subscribe. It helps us keep making stories like this one. And tell us in the comments, have you ever cooked something over a fire and known, by the smell alone, that it was ready? She had $10 in her pocket and no car. She had Delia's ladle and hearth tongs and the Dutch oven in her rucksack. She found the listing in the free weekly paper at the laundromat on Greenville Avenue, the Augusta County Shopper, a 4-page tabloid of classifieds and yard sale announcements. Buried in the back page, in the county surplus section, stone building, approx 1,800 square feet, on 1.2 acres, Valley Turnpike south of Greenville. Built 1843. Former use inn. Asking $10. Contact county clerk. She walked to the Augusta County Clerk's office in Staunton the next morning. The clerk, a man in his 60s named Mr. Pendleton, stamped the deed and handed Prue a heavy iron key on a loop of hemp cord. "The Whitaker Inn," Mr. Pendleton said. "Your grandmother used to tell people about that building. She said the hearth was the biggest in the county." He looked at Prue. "Are you Delia's granddaughter?" Prue said, "Yes, sir." Mr. Pendleton said, "Then you know what you're getting into." She hitchhiked south on Route 11 and walked the last 2 miles down the old Valley Turnpike to the inn. It stood on a low rise above the road exactly as Dileia had described. A 2-story limestone building with a standing seam tin roof, a wide front porch with stone columns, a massive central chimney, and a heavy oak door with iron strap hinges. She put the key in the lock. It turned. The ground floor was one large room, the common room where the travelers had eaten and sat by the fire. Limestone walls, a wide plank chestnut floor, heavy timber beams. And against the back wall, the hearth. 6 feet wide, 4 feet tall, the limestone blackened by 112 years of cooking fires. The rotating crane was still in place, the iron arm extending from the left wall on a pivot, with hooks for 6 pots. The spit jack, a mechanical device that turned the roasting spit using a clockwork weight and gear mechanism, was mounted in the right wall of the hearth, the brass gears green with age but intact. To the right of the hearth, a narrow stone staircase descended to the root cellar, a cool, dry space beneath the common room, stone-walled, with a packed earth floor and vaulted ceiling. The cellar had been used for food storage, root vegetables, preserved meats, cider barrels. Along the back wall, on a stone shelf, sat a wooden box with iron corner brackets and a hinged lid, the kind of box a careful person builds when they want something to last. Prue opened the box. Inside, a leather tool roll containing a set of hearth tools, a hand-forged spitjack winding key, a set of 4 iron trivets of graduating sizes, a rotating crane arm extension that would double the reach of the crane, and a matched set of 3 copper ladles with iron handles. Beside the tool roll, a heavy canvas pouch, and beneath both, a thick leather-bound ledger. The canvas pouch held gold coins, 40 Liberty Quarter eagles dated between 1843 and 1911. The coin dealer in Staunton valued them at approximately $25,000. The ledger was a guest book, page after page of handwritten entries recording the name, origin, destination, and date of every traveler who had stayed at the Whitaker Inn from its opening in 1843 until its closing in 1912. 69 years of names, thousands of travelers. The handwriting changed across the decades. Josiah's careful script in the early pages, his son's bolder hand in the middle years, his grandson's hurried pencil in the final entries. The last entry, on the last page, read, March 14, 1912. Mr. James Doyle, Richmond to Lexington, traveling by motor car. The last guest, God keep the road. Tucked inside the back cover was a folded letter. To whoever finds this cellar. My name is Ephraim Whitaker, grandson of Josiah, who built this inn in 1843. Today is the 16th of March, 1912. The motor car has ended the Stagecoach and the Stagecoach Inn with it. I am closing this house. I am leaving the hearth, tools, and my savings and the guest ledger in the cellar, because the cellar is the driest and coolest room in a stone building, and what is stored, cool and dry, will keep. The guest ledger is the record of every soul who ate at this hearth and slept under this roof for 69 years. It cannot be replaced. The hearth tools are what we use to feed them. Feed the next traveler who comes through the door. Ephraim Whitaker, innkeeper, March 16, 1912. Prue read the letter twice. Then she opened the guest ledger to the last page and read the final entry again. Mr. James Doyle, Richmond to Lexington, traveling by motor car. The last guest. God keep the road. She held the page open and looked at the handwriting, Ephraim's hurried pencil, the letters slanting forward as though the words were in a hurry to be written. And she did not cry, and she did not speak. She simply read the name and the date and the blessing, and she understood that the man who had written this entry had known, as he wrote it, that it was the last one, and that the blessing was not for James Doyle, but for the road itself. She said quietly, to the cellar and the stone stairs and the hearth above, "Thank you, Mr. Whitaker. I will feed whoever comes." The next morning, she hitchhiked to Staunton and deposited the coin dealer's check at the bank on Beverly Street. She opened a checking account and walked out into the March wind. The following week, she bought a used truck, a 2002 Ford Ranger with 174,000 miles and a bench seat patched with duct tape, from a retired farmer in Greenville for $1,900. The first month was the hearth. 112 years of soot and creosote had built up in the flue above the cooking hearth, and a family of raccoons had nested in the chimney cap. Prue climbed the limestone walls using a ladder. Mr. Pendleton from the clerk's office drove out on a Saturday morning in his pickup, and she worked a chimney brush down the flue from the top, the creosote and nesting material falling into the hearth below in thick black chunks. Mr. Pendleton stood at the bottom and shoveled the debris into feed sacks. "My wife's family used to stop at this inn on the way to Lexington," Mr. Pendleton said, filling a sack. "Her grandmother told her the cornbread here was the best cornbread in the valley. Her grandmother was born in 1888. That's how long people remembered the food. She made the inn livable in pieces. She bought a folding army cot from the thrift store in Staunton for $15 and set it against the south wall of the common room, near the window that faced the Valley Turnpike, so she could lie in the dark and see the road. She found a cast-iron Franklin stove at an estate sale in Stewart's Draft for $50. The inn's hearth was too large for daily heating, and a small stove in the corner would warm the room without burning through a cord of wood every week. A woman named Mrs. Lamb, who ran the feed store in Greenville, drove out to the inn one Sunday afternoon with a box of kitchen supplies, a coffee pot, 2 tin mugs, a cast-iron skillet, a sack of cornmeal, a dozen eggs, a pound of butter, and a jar of apple butter she had put up herself. Dileia Whitaker bought cornmeal from my mother's store every Saturday for 20 years, Mrs. Lamb said. When I heard her granddaughter was at the old inn, I figured you'd need cornmeal before you'd need anything else. She came back every Sunday after that. She always brought cornmeal. The first fire Prue lit in the hearth, not the Franklin stove, but the cooking hearth, the 6-foot limestone hearth with the crane and the spit jack, was a small fire of hickory splits she had gathered from the woodlot behind the inn. She raked the coals into a bed and set Delia's Dutch oven in the ashes and mixed cornbread batter in the cast-iron bowl and poured it into the Dutch oven and raked coals onto the lid and waited. The smell filled the common room, the smell of cornbread baking over hardwood coals in a stone hearth, the specific warm, sweet smell that had filled this room for 112 years and had then been absent for 112 years and was now, on this evening, back. The cornbread came out golden on top and brown on the bottom. She sat on the cot and ate the first slice in the firelight. And the taste was Delia's taste, and the smell was Delia's smell. And the hearth that had been cold since 1912 was warm. She set Delia's photograph on the limestone mantel above the hearth. Dileia at the boarding house hearth in 1988, face lit by coals. She placed the guest ledger on a wooden stand she built from scrap chestnut and set it on the mantel beside the photograph, open to the first page. April 3rd, 1843. Mr. William Crane, Staunton to Natural Bridge, traveling by stage. The first guest. She hung the copper ladles from the crane hooks and set the trivets on the hearthstone and mounted the spit-jack winding key on the iron bracket where it had hung for 69 years. The hearth looked complete. The hearth looked like it was waiting for the next pot. She got a job in her second year. A historic site in Staunton, a restored frontier inn that offered period cooking demonstrations, hired her as a part-time hearth cook and interpreter, because the director, a woman named Mrs. Donahue, had heard from Mr. Pendleton that a young woman had reopened the Whitaker Inn and was cooking on the original hearth. Mrs. Donahue had driven out to the inn and had watched Prue cook a pot of beans on the crane and bake cornbread in the Dutch oven and turn a chicken on the spit using the clockwork spit jack, and she had tasted the beans and said, "Where did you learn to cook like this?" Prue said, "My grandmother's boarding house." Mrs. Donahue said, "I've been running hearth cooking programs for 15 years and I have never tasted beans this good. This isn't a demonstration. This is the real thing." Word spread through Greenville and the surrounding valley. A church in Staunton hired Prue to cook a harvest dinner for 60 people on the inn's hearth. Beans, cornbread, pot roast, and apple cobbler, all cooked over coals, served on tin plates at long wooden tables she had built from scrap lumber. A food writer from Charlottesville drove an hour to eat at the hearth and wrote about the inn in a regional magazine, calling it the last working stagecoach hearth in the Shenandoah Valley. A retired truck driver named Carl, who had eaten at Delia's boarding house every Wednesday for 11 years in the 1990s, read the article and drove to the inn and stood in the common room looking at the hearth and said, "It smells like Delia's place. It smells exactly like Delia's place." Prue said, "Same cornmeal, same fire, same Dutch oven." Carl said, "Same hands?" He came back every Wednesday. On a clear evening in late October of her 26th year, Prue sat on the stone porch of the inn and watched the last copper light fade across the Shenandoah Valley. The Valley Turnpike ran south through the rolling farmland below, the same road the stagecoaches had traveled for 69 years. The same road James Doyle had driven his motor car down in March of 1912. Smoke rose from the chimney, thin and straight in the still autumn air. Inside, the hearth glowed. The crane held an empty pot and the guest ledger stood open on the mantel to the last page. The last guest. God keep the road. She thought about Josiah, who had built this hearth in 1843 and had fed every person who came through the door for 27 years without asking who they were. She thought about Ephraim, who had written the last entry and sealed the tools and the ledger in the cellar because he had understood that the cellar was the driest room, and that what was stored, cool and dry, would keep. And she thought about Dileia, who had cooked on a stone hearth for 28 years in a boarding house on Route 11, feeding truck drivers and construction workers and travelers, because Dileia had understood what Josiah had understood, that feeding a stranger was not charity. It was the oldest work. It was the work the road required. That's the thing about the fires our grandmothers teach us to tend. We do not always know, when we are 5 years old and carrying kindling to a hearth, that the carrying is itself the trade. We learn it slowly, summer by summer, fire by fire, and then, 3 years after the old woman dies, we walk into a building she told us about and light a fire in a hearth that has been cold for 100 years, and we understand what she had been teaching us. She had been teaching us that a hearth is not a fireplace. A hearth is a promise. The promise is, whoever comes through the door will be fed. Prue Whitaker was 23 years old and homeless. She had $10 to her name, and she spent it on an abandoned Stagecoach Inn on the old Valley Turnpike in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. It was the best $10 she ever spent. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you loved it, we have something special for you. 12 brand new stories, never released on YouTube. Only available to the people who support this channel directly. Each one a full Quiet Road story, just like this one. There is also a full audiobook available for the people who want to listen to all 12 in one place. You will find the link in the bio. We poured our whole hearts into these, and we made them for the people who truly listen. Thank you for being one of them. See you on the next Quiet Road.